Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to be sitting here with our next guest. I had first heard of Miranda Macpherson through a friend of mine who had interviewed her for his show, and that was a few years back. I didn't give it much thought, but I had seen Miranda's image appear in my mind or on the Facebook wall or on social media, and there was definitely a curiosity as to Miranda's work. Eventually, a friend of mine would mention that he saw one of her videos and that I should check it out, and so I did, and there was an immediate draw to this peace, this sense of grace and ease from which her teaching seemed to emerge, and so I was immediately hooked. So I reached out to her with an inquiry to interview her, and she doesn't do many of these interviews. So when she said yes, I was excited. My name is Craig Villarrubia, and I want to welcome and invite you to this interview session with Miranda Macpherson. Miranda, welcome, and thank you for meeting with me today. I'm so excited to be with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Craig. Thank you for inviting me.
You know, as I was preparing for this interview, I certainly had a lot of questions in mind as to what I wanted to talk about. But what keeps coming up to my mind right now is this idea of non-duality. So I would like to just start off with the question, if you can just share what, from your point of view, what is non-duality?
That's a really important and great question, so I'm glad we're starting here. Really, the word non-duality means not two. And so non-duality really means unity consciousness. And so that really means that, we are not separate from the ground of existence and from anything or from anyone, and that there is a dimension of our being, our true foundation, that is unified. And so this is, I think, a really important thing for our time, and I think partly why it's become so popular recently is that we see so much division in our world, so much suffering caused by this pernicious knot in our consciousness where we believe and act and relate as if you and I are different from one another fundamentally. And that's really the birthing place of so much unnecessary suffering, so much ignorance, so much greed, so much hatred, so much violence, that I think right now it's especially important that we explore this subject of the unified field of our being and how we can live that in a grounded and true way.
Yeah, and I think many of us can relate to some of the challenges and the suffering and some of the things that you pointed out as a result of this perception of division. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the people that listen to these interviews that I share, and certainly on my website, they see that, but yet are still challenged with how to come into the experience of what you just shared about non-duality.
Well, that's always the case, because we can read very beautiful scriptures that give a flavor, and it's important to read those scriptures, ancient teachings, because we, through reading the consciousness of enlightenment, whether it's through the Buddhist lineage or the Advaita lineage or the Christian lineage, you'll see that in all of the great mystical traditions, you will find non-dual understanding in there, and yet just understanding it conceptually doesn't really change our consciousness enough. And so what most teachings have to say about this is that we firstly need to bring to the light of awareness the places where we are divided, where our consciousness is dual, is split off into separate parts of good, bad, right, wrong, self, other, all these mental boundaries and constructs that, until we've woken up out of them directly for ourselves, they feel very real and true. And so there is work involved, there is spiritual practice involved, even though, as A Course in Miracles so beautifully says, The work, the journey, is a journey without distance from a place we've never really left. And so there's a paradox in this whole field of non-duality and a lot of confusion, I think, because people don't really understand the paradox and the levels that are simultaneous and part of the unity, that, there is inner work to be done. There is practice that's involved. There is discipline. There is rigor and commitment. And yet at the same time, all of that discipline and commitment is so that our separate self consciousness can relax, can allow a surrender, can dissolve back into the substance of what it actually already fundamentally is. So I like to think of that process as a process of ego relaxation. And it's a little bit like, if we use the analogy of ice, if we think of our ego, the sense of separate me with all its patterns and fears and constructs and concerns and difficult habits that are not easy to uproot. If we think of that as like a big hard block of ice, right? We see from the non-dual perspective that ice, the actual substance of ice, is always water. It's just that when it's frozen, it's hard, inflexible, impermeable. It doesn't give much. It doesn't give very much. And so I like to think of the work or the practice of non-dual realization as ego relaxation. And it's like bringing that hard block of ice, the hard parts of ourselves, into the warmth of the sun, so that the ice can melt back into water, become fluid and clear and transparent again, which is its fundamental nature. It's your and my fundamental nature.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. You certainly put, as I'm listening to you, you certainly put in perspective, or I felt that the way that you shared it certainly puts in perspective that this idea that the ego is a bad thing and something we have to fight is probably not as helpful, perhaps, as looking at it from the perspective that we are relaxing the ego, as opposed to trying to battle with it.
Well, when you look at the battle of ego annihilation, then it kind of exposes itself, because who or what's trying to annihilate who, right? So usually what we see in the battle to try to get rid of our ego or push it aside is really self-hatred in disguise, and so much kind of rejection of our humanity, of just where we are. It creates a lot of inner violence that ultimately further divides our consciousness. It makes it more dual, and because the effect of that brings a loss of peace, a loss of wholeness and inner harmony, it usually creates a lot more violence and aggression and tension in our world, in our relationships, in our way of being in life. And so, again, I feel that this practice that seems very subtle and esoteric of ego relaxation is actually very important, not just for our personal awakening, but for the awakening of the whole.
Yeah, I mean, even in terms of relationships, I certainly know that in a relationship situation, a battle with anything seemingly outside of me is not a fun experience, and certainly coming to it with a common sense of peace or the intent of bringing ease certainly feels much better and probably allows for a higher intelligence to intervene. I heard you mention A Course in Miracles, and as you know, and as I shared before, and a lot of my listeners are used to talking about A Course in Miracles, it's been a part of my path. How do you see A Course in Miracles in relation to non-duality, or what are some of the similarities as to where A Course in Miracles is pointing and the experience of non-duality?
Well, I think we need to understand first that there are many non-dual traditions. So just to use non-duality as its own tradition isn't quite correct. Because if you look at the teachings of, Theravadan Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, they're both non-dual teachings in their own way, but they have a very particular approach to non-duality, to bringing about the unified condition, the liberated condition. If you look at Advaita Vedanta, it has a very particular approach to non-duality. If you look at Kashmiri Shaivism, there's a broader, it seems, a more full-bodied understanding of what non-duality is. And of course, the Course in Miracles, being its own tradition, if you like, and a newer tradition. It was born in the late 60s, early 70s. And so, it has its non-duality. And so I think it's helpful to, really understand that there are nuances in the non-dual streams, and to be willing to learn from them all, and also to allow the possibility, well, the likelihood really, that there might be, one kind of stream of practice and philosophy in non-dual world that feels more resonant and true to us, even though there are a lot of similarities. For example, one of the main differences in Advaita Vedanta and also in A Course in Miracles, they hold the view that the world is an illusion, is maya, is not actually fundamentally real. And therefore, that can be very helpful, but it can also lend itself to distortions of bypassing or, disengaging from the world in a way that's defensive, checking out from it, rather than letting our kind of experience in the world be part of the liberation and the healing of our consciousness, which I think is its real intention in A Course in Miracles. But in Kashmiri Shaivism and Tibetan Buddhism, for example, they have an understanding that, the world it's all real, it's all God, everything is God. And that is more where I rest in terms of what makes the most sense to me based on my own experience of awakening and my continued journeying into that. In that perspective that, is very strong in the Kashmiri Shaivite tradition is very helpful, because it helps me the most to allow integration from all of the places where I might be dividing one part into another, body and soul, mind and heart, physical world, non-physical world, eternal and temporal. If we really look at the depth of everything, there really is only God. There really is only reality with a capital R. And so for me personally, that's what rings the most true. But I think it's a very personal thing, and that everyone needs to kind of really feel into that and let their own experience be the guide. And if there's one thing that all of the non-dual traditions encourage, and that is, really letting one's own direct experience, following the thread of one's direct experience, be the guru.
I love that you just shared that, because in what seems to be happening in my experience, or my direct experience, having worked with A Course in Miracles for many years now, is, and perhaps you can help me out with this, it feels like my direct experience is almost loosening itself, or seemingly dissolving, or basically not recognizing certain concepts that are presented in the Course as something to continue with as this awakening seems to continue. And I don't know how to express that clearly. I hope that makes sense. I would love to get, from your point of view, what your experience is, or what may be helpful.
Well, if you really want to go back to what the Course is offering as a practical guideline for pretty much everything, every grappling that you have with the Course in Miracles, would really be answered by the same response: take it into prayer to the Holy Spirit. And so that's the primary method that the Course is using over and over and over again. And so when we look at what the Holy Spirit is, people who've come from a Christian background and have, moved on from that Christian background often don't like the term Holy Spirit. But if you really understand that the Holy Spirit is the spirit of holiness, the spirit of wholeness, and so it is an active presence that is here to really help us as a bridge to come into presence, into wisdom, into understanding, into unity. And so it requires an ongoing humility from us to, come with that attitude of, I don't know, show me. That really sincere, prayerful, humble, curious, pure intention that doesn't, hold on defensively to any position. And this is such an important thing, I find, whatever path we're walking, whatever non-dual philosophy that we're working with, ultimately this sort of prayerful, humble quality is really the big key, I think. Because it's that makes us receptive to grace, receptive to a grace deeper than our present understanding. And if there's anything that I've learned, it's that whatever we think, enlightenment is, or the enlightened condition is, there's just reams and reams and reams, universes more. And for the moment I've sort of felt like, oh great, that's it. No, there's a settling there for a while, and then there's a whole other gate that opens, and a whole other process of surrender and opening and letting go of any position of fixed belief about anything, comes forth. And the Course in Miracles in itself says something very beautiful about this. It says, be still and lay aside all thoughts of what you are and what God is, all ideas you've learned before about anything. Empty your mind of everything you think is true or false, good or bad, everything of which you're ashamed, everything you judge worthy or unworthy. It goes on, I'm paraphrasing now. Essentially, it says, forget this world, forget even this course, and come with wholly empty hands unto your God. For my money, that's it. Right there.
Just listening
That's
to you.
yeah.
It's like I can feel it. It's just like boom. It's like
Right. And so that, if you notice how you feel, as I've just shared that with you, there's a very, very powerful invitation to be absolutely naked, absolutely open, absolutely receptive to grace itself, to the living, dynamic presence of the mystery revealing itself afresh to you in each moment and teaching you directly from the inside who you are, how it is. And because your nature and my nature and the nature of everything and everyone is quite literally boundless, there is no limit to, what we can learn and discover and know about who and what we really are. So beautiful.
thank you for sharing that. It also kind of puts in perspective or reminds me of something that I've heard you share in some of your teachings, which is be nothing, do nothing, get nothing, become nothing.
Seek for nothing, relinquish nothing, be as you are, rest in God. Yeah, well, that really is the nucleus of everything that I share with people, and it's really that which was a transmission that I received by grace in the cave that was the home of Ramana Maharshi in South India, that was really the awakening into, non-dual realization. I would say that up until that point, I was very intimate with God as boundless love, God as the depth of my heart, and the luminous light of divine nature. It was very intimate for me, and had been for, I don't know, more than 25 years when it first awoken within me when I was a teenager, and years of practice and dedication. But still, prior to that awakening, there was a sense of a me and a God as two things. Well, in that sitting in Ramana's cave, and that sort of inner kind of explosion that happened, that just stopped the two-ness, really. And so the experience was just of silent, luminous being, not being a self, not being an individual self. Only I was still here. And so that's the paradox of the mystery, is that it felt like something had died, only it wasn't what we think of as death. It really felt like I was actually alive for the first time. But I didn't fully understand the experience at the time. It took quite a long time to let that awakening reverberate through me, and initiated huge changes on every level of my life, which was, quite a test to let those changes happen. And then it took years to integrate it, and to the point where I could understand what this really meant, not only for my life, but for the life of others. And so the teaching started to emerge, the teaching of holistic awakening started to emerge, and ego relaxation, and the pillars of awakening, and, all the dimensions of grace that are really foundational to what I teach and share with people. There's a whole map that's come out of it that is as much about integrating the realization so that we can really live it moment to moment, as well as allowing our consciousness to keep expanding into direct experience of what we are and who we are. And so it continues. I wouldn't say that I'm in any way complete or finished. I don't really know that I could say that. It's a continual process of discovery. But the invitation to be nothing, do nothing, get nothing, become nothing, seek for nothing, relinquish nothing, be as you are, rest in God, is really like kind of a very loving but powerful slice through everything that we normally think of as who we are and how to be. And so it's a powerful invitation to let go, to surrender, to stop.
Yeah.
To let ourselves taken by something deeper than this thing called me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it feels great. And then there's also the thought that comes through. So how does anything get done? And so
Well,
I'd love for you
it's
to
a very
share.
important question. I'm happy to share about that. Take a look outside of your window, wherever you're listening to this, and you just take in the plant life, and you take in nature. What starts to become very obvious is that being can be very dynamic. And so being itself knows exactly how to grow, unfold, make the sun rise and set, planets to revolve around one another, human beings to fall in love with one another and have sex and allow new human beings to come onto this earth. And, there's so much dynamism that's inherent to being itself. And so again, there's a level confusion that often happens when people hear be nothing, do nothing, get nothing, etc. They think, oh, good, well, I'll just sort of blob out and not fulfill my daily tasks or not engage any practices, and great, that'll be enlightenment. And no, not usually, sometimes, but not usually. And so it's really a stopping of the ego activity, the constant chasing after special states, the constant rejection of what's so, the constant manipulation and commentation, That's really what be nothing, get nothing, do nothing is speaking to. It's really speaking to the one that thinks it has to run the show, the one that thinks I'm the doer and it's all up to me, I'm the one that makes everything happen, I'm the captain of this ship. It's throwing a very lovely boomerang through the very center of that and inviting that to stop. And so the stopping, the surrendering is really of the mind, of the ego mind, of the patterned mind. And so when that quiets down, when that we can allow that to stop by just relaxing the chasing after the storyline, the chasing after the strategy to fix it and make it and rearrange it and control it, rearrange ourselves, rearrange someone else, manipulate the environment in some way in the hope that we'll be able to have some peace if things are just so, then when we relax that, we often discover, surprisingly, that when we get out of the way, we recognize that we exist because of grace, in a field of grace, that there is so much love and goodness and beauty and joy and peace that's inherent to our being, and it's sown through every cell, every fiber of ourself, and so we can't actually be separate from it. It's not possible. We can only be hovering on the surface of ourself, identified with the constructs, and so we can only be ignorant of the love and the beauty and the depth and the power and the majesty. We can never actually be apart from it. And that's why the Course in Miracles says it's a journey without distance from a place you've never really left.
It's beautiful, and even as you asked me to look outside the window, there's something that knows that everything is going to happen as it's going to happen, and I was never really in charge in the first place. And a beautiful symbol of that here on the property is we just had a couple of calves that were born, and it's so interesting to watch them, literally come into this world and through grace know exactly what needs to be done. The mother, whatever it is that she's to do, and it's like the baby finds the nipple for its nourishment, and there's no thought there. It's not like the calf is thinking where. The question doesn't even surface. It's just like what's happening. And I think from that standpoint, and from what I'm hearing you say, is really that's everything.
It's huge, and thank you so much for bringing that example, because it's so palpable and obvious. That when we don't interfere, with our mind, then the forces of being are so profound. We see it very directly in the birthing process, and we were all birthed into being by grace. A pregnant mother doesn't have to hold her belly and say, "Come on, little baby, it's really time. We've got to grow some limbs here. We can do it. If we really try, come on, you and me, we can do it." Right? That's not necessary. The intelligence and the power and the dynamism is inherent. And so it's really so much of the process is about trusting our own true nature. And so that's why I use this lovely term, homeostasis of the soul, that our soul actually does know the way. But it does need support, does need the right conditions. So often what we're getting up to in our ordinary way of being, judging, assessing, comparing, commentating, efforting, controlling, that's interference, interfering with the natural dynamism and grace that is intelligent and knows how to be what it is. And so this is why Ramana Maharshi, who's really my Satguru, kept inviting people all the time to be as you are. He said, be still, be as you are. What could be simpler than that? And yet, we are so attached to this notion that we birthed ourselves, which is profoundly arrogant, really, profoundly ignorant, And when clearly we didn't, we were birthed by something utterly majestic and profound, and that everything and everyone else was too, and that this is natural, this is happening all the time, and that the intelligence is in the babe that wants the nipple and knows how to suckle, and the intuitive knowledge is there in the physiology of the mother, and also the nourishment is there in the form of the mother falling in love with her child. So all these things are natural. That brings forth what's needed for us to flourish and thrive. Now, unfortunately, often there are many interferences that happen in this process, and this makes up how we get separated and fall from the state of grace. And, I think it's very helpful to remember that that's no one's fault that happens, even though that happens very personally in different ways for each of us due to how it was with our early years and our parents and our environment. It's really inevitable. It seems just that part of the ticket price of being human. And therefore, again, I don't think it's wrong. I don't think it could be wrong. I think it's part of the journey. And yet, so is waking up to our fundamental nature part of the journey. Only, as the Course says, all are called and few choose to answer the call. And so I think it's very beautiful when we can feel that desire inside, whether it's triggered by some deep suffering that we can't resolve, or whether it's triggered by trauma, or whether it's triggered by something that we can't even name, just all of a sudden rising to the foreground that makes us yearn for something deeper and more substantial and foundational. It's a great blessing when that happens. There are many beings for whom that doesn't arise in this life. And so if it's arising in your life, it's tremendous grace, even in and of itself. And so that grace contains within it the wisdom with what's needed, what path is most helpful, what teacher might be helpful, what practices might best support, what virtues need to be developed, what kind of psychodynamic patterns might need to be forgiven and worked through. I just keep coming back to grace myself.
That's beautiful.
It's all grace.
Just listening to you, it's clear that I had nothing to do with this awakening. I can't take any responsibility. I can't even say that it was me that decided, oh, okay, I want to awaken. It's like, when I really look at that, I feel like it has and is given. And so to what you're saying, it really hits home.
And yet there's such a beautiful dance between grace and what appears to be our dedication on the path. And when you look at it deeply, where is our dedication emerging from? That's an interesting question in and of itself. But, I love the Zen saying that, spiritual enlightenment is a divine accident, but that spiritual practice makes one more accident prone. And so I think there's a lot of confusion in the non-dual circles that because we're already that, our nature already is, the absolute, therefore there's no point in practicing because that reifies some illusion that there's somewhere to get to in some future time. I think that's a subtle misunderstanding because, if you look at most of the enlightened, giants that we've seen in various traditions, you see that all of them had a practice. Even after their realization, Ramana Maharshi was meditating in the cave in silence for 15 years after realizing I am that, And so why was he doing that? Why was that happening? We see that Nisargadatta, who wrote I Am That and was thunderous, luminous inspiration for this whole non-dual movement, most people don't know this, but he did, traditional puja around Hindu deities 5 times a day, every day. We see that Jesus went into the desert for the metaphorical 40 days and 40 nights where he went through some kind of, spiritual purification and testing before he entered his ministry. And even after his ministry, he prayed and taught others how to pray, and, the Buddha meditated. And so you see this, that, spiritual practice, whether it be prayer, meditation, inquiry, devotion, in a way, it doesn't have to be subject-object. And this is particularly true of devotional practice. I'm very devotional in my nature, and it was interesting what happened after the sort of non-dual awakening was that I couldn't pray or chant anymore. It was very disconcerting because prayer and devotional practice, as well as meditation, had been so primary for me for 20 years. And as a teacher, if you'd asked me any question, prior to that time, and I was teaching for 15 years before that awakening, my answer to any question would have been, well, have you prayed on it? And what is your prayer brought forth? And how about we pray together? That's what I would have said to you when you presented any problem to me, And so here I was, I couldn't pray anymore. It was very odd. And I couldn't pray because it didn't feel like there wasn't a me separate from a God to pray. So who prays to what, So it was kind of awkward, and I just kept hearing inwardly Ramana's voice saying, just be quiet, just be quiet, just be still. And I knew that was good advice. So I let myself just be still, be quiet, and sat in the silence a lot. And I just let myself go with what was clearly asked, what was wanted. And, that happened for about 3-4 months, And then one day I was in a silent retreat in Holland, and it was morning time, and I was out in the woods and I was running. And I used to love to run. I don't anymore because my back's dodgy, but I used to love to run, and I was just running. And all of a sudden I started chanting. Like my heart just exploded with mantra. And I'm chanting this Sri Ram Jai Ram chant and it was just ecstatic joy. And I was laughing and chanting and laughing, and my heart was just exploding. And there was a total collapse of subject and object, and a total integration of devotional practice. And I was laughing in the awareness of it is that, same singing to that, in love and devotion and pleasure of the recognition of it all, in celebration of it all. And so it just was utterly natural to chant mantra. And now there's no problem. I chant and sing all the time, and encourage my students to chant and sing, because it's such a beautiful way of just coming out of the mind, of just turning into that non-linear place where we remember, where we know, where we feel the lyrical pulse, the dance of love loving itself. Love recognizing the source of its own nature and singing praise to that remembrance, in remembrance of it all. So beautiful. So that's happened to me many times, and with prayer too. I found my way. In fact, prayer has found its way back. Only, when I pray, beloved, I'm not praying to something that's separate to my own depth. I'm praying to that depth that is my own depth as well as the absolute simultaneously. And so I love to share this because I think it's so helpful. And other methods like concentration practices. I teach my students various methods of meditation, and some of them involve techniques of concentrating and collecting your attention so that, you can actually let go of the method and just be. But I find that most people read books about, non-dual, meditation and stuff, and they get very confused, and they try and sit and meditate, and they just end up bumbling around in their mind and getting frustrated, or else drifting off into some disassociative condition and calling that non-dual realization when it's not. It's a disassociative moment. There's a difference. So, that's where I think having, teachers that we find trustworthy, that also are willing to be transparent and real. Very helpful to clarify such confusions and help us find what's supportive for us, what brings forth the homeostasis that we need to let the pulse of the inner knowing find its way.
Thank you for sharing that. I think for me, sometimes the thought, or for me, it seems like I need to be reminded that it's not about, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it's like, it's, this idea of practice that you shared, that it still comes in and however it comes in, this idea of prayer. So it's like, even I had the thought the other day, I'm like, well, I don't want anything, so what's the point of praying? It's like, and then the Course talks about that we shouldn't pray for things. So it's like, okay, then what am I praying for? But what I'm hearing and what I'm feeling is it's really almost like it's almost like a devotional to self, coming into
It is.
coming into that appreciation of its brilliance.
Yes, and of its beauty and of its majesty. And it's a conscious offering of one's being, of oneself, back to the origin of our being. And Ramana said something very beautiful about this. Someone once asked him, what is the end of the path of jnana, of wisdom? And he said, to know that oneself is not separate from the absolute and to relinquish the concept, I am the doer. And then someone asked him, and what is the end of the path of bhakti, of devotion? And he said, to recognize that when one's actions performed selflessly in devotion to the truth are God's actions. And so we see that what he's saying about the end of the path of jnana and the end of the path of the bhakti is the same end, is really a dissolving of the me and the my, and the realization that one's being is none other than that, right? And to let everything happen from that awareness, to let actions happen from that inner abiding, to live according to that, to relax the sense of I am the doer, I am the master of the universe, this is my life, it belongs to me. Well, really? That's a very interesting presupposition.
Yeah, and it's me that's supposed to take care of it and be responsible for generating its happiness, which is obviously not
Right.
a successful venture.
Not really, but at the same time, it also means, we still do the work we need to do. We still need to, earn money. We still have responsibilities. We still, people are still raising children and are accountable to their partners in relationship. And, the deep non-dual condition doesn't have to exclude any of that. Because if we really understand that the depth of all things is this one unified ground of being, then it totally includes all the ordinary aspects of life. And I love how Ramana said that. He said, the true realized condition is not separate from the ordinary activities of life. And when you really study his biographies, many people don't do that, but it's fascinating to see that he was completely meticulous about how the money was to be kept in the ashram, how the books were to be bound, how the toilets were to be cleaned, how the animals were to be cared for, how the food was to be prepared in the kitchen so that it was healthy and wouldn't be too hot and spicy for Westerners. An amazing array of very pragmatic details that, when you really understand that it's all part of God, then everything is a form of worship. Everything is worthy of our full attention. Everything has its place. Nothing is excluded. And this is, for me, such hope for our humanity, because it really helps us to decompress out of this, very split off compartmentalized way of being that unfortunately is so prevalent in the West. And it's unhealthy, it's unwholesome.
And so our part to what I hear from your teachings is really to act, but first consulting with this presence, and entrusting that presence knows what's best for the whole. We will solve all problems. Is that fair to say? That
I think
simply.
that's ultimately true. Only what's also true is that in order to be able to really fluidly be that receptive and to live in that receptive state each moment, usually, we have to sort of take a more honest look at what's in the way of that. And so there's no human being who hasn't developed a personality structure that have distorted their vision of reality and brought about certain patterns of closure that become habitual. And anyone who's on a real spiritual path knows all about this from first-hand experience. And so all of the great teachings are inviting us to bring what's classically in the East called our vasanas, the obscurations, the veils, the false beliefs, the habits, the stuck patterns, to the light of awareness. And so a lot of non-dual spiritual practice in various traditions involves inquiry. And inquiry is very much about letting the vasanas be seen for what they are, letting those obscurations be understood, letting them be contacted lovingly, with non-judgment, but seen through. Because we have to see through these layers and habits. They have to be contacted, by grace, with an unconditional presence. And when they are, they often disappear, dissolve, self-liberate, or at the very least, become a little more transparent. Either way, there's a disidentification process that takes place. And this usually takes time. A disidentification from one ego structure can happen in an instant, but often some of the deeper habits and mechanisms and beliefs can keep reasserting themselves. And so, again, this is where we need, not just devotion. According to, my own experience, we need inquiry, we need meditation, we need the support of like-minded others we can check things out with and get a reality check. And, so in A Course in Miracles language, this is very much the kind of working through our defense mechanisms, and opening to let our defenses relax so that we become more defenseless. And in that defenselessness, we are more available, we're more spontaneously available to the presence. And so we can hear it, not just hearing a voice, but we can sense the way of things. Our mind can open up to retrieve deeper wisdom and knowingness. There's a clarification of our consciousness that starts to take place. And that usually takes place over a course of time.
The Course talks about that voice being the voice of the Holy Spirit. And what I appreciate about your teaching, or what I'm gathering from what you're sharing, is that you never even once mentioned that this presence or this grace is actually speaking in words. So it kind of lifts the scope.
Well, it's interesting that it does for many. I hear words, but I also hear sound, subtle sound, hear mantra, hear music. But then I'm very musical, very auditory. And so neuroscience research has shown us that we all have different dominances. Some of us are more open in the auditory, so we hear directly. Some of us are more awake somatically, and so we feel things, we get a somatic kind of resonance, or that brings forth a kind of visceral knowing, a gut knowing, right? Some of us kind of feel more a presence, like feel there's a presence of love, and some of us kind of get shown a vision. And actually all four of those gates can open up. There's no limit. But this is partly why I teach. There's a whole specific teaching that I give on this whole theme of Your Soul Knows the Way, that we teach a whole retreat on it. And so there's a whole body of teaching about what it takes to really open to that stream of inner guidance. And not only to open to that stream, but how to discriminate inner guidance, the voice of truth, the presence of truth, from subtle delusion. And considering how much atrocities have happened on our planet because people believe they heard the voice of the Holy Spirit, or they believe they're hearing the message of Allah, and using that to justify, doing horrendous things. It's not just a matter of opening up the inner stream, of discriminating and understanding how you can tell whether it really is truth in guidance from subtle delusion is extremely important. So to be sort of succinct about that, it's a big conversation, but some of the pointers that I often give people around how to discriminate is, if guidance is true, considering that the nature of ultimate reality is unified, the guidance or the presence will always have a kind of a tone of it being good for all, because the mind of God is a unified mind. And so therefore, it's not going to be good for you and smiting someone else. That doesn't make any sense. It's not congruent with unity consciousness. Similarly, true guidance will always come with a loving, beneficent, peaceful tone, even though it might be delivering some content that might be inviting us to confront some falsity, right? Or take a stand for something that's important. But it will still have a tone of love, because the consciousness of the Absolute is loving. So also, it's usually we see in mystical traditions where some of the mystics have had visions. Often the vision has been confirmed, like 3 times. Like even in the Bible, you hear the cock crowed 3 times. So it's always good, if we're unsure, to pray and ask, for help with the discrimination. To ask, if this is true, give me confirmation that is clear and recognizable. And so when we pray a prayer like that, usually, like a book kind of falls off the shelf and opens at a page and there it is, the confirmation. Or a friend phones and they say the exact words that we were given, or something happens and it's the seeming synchronicities emerge to confirm or not confirm the guidance. And of course, if we're really in doubt, it's good to talk it through with someone who we know loves the truth as much as we do and can help us really ascertain whether this is trustworthy or not. But after a while, it starts to become very clear, the ring of, the presence and its guidance. And, in a way, it reveals itself.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes, and I want to ask you a final question, Miranda. From your perspective, what is enlightenment?
I don't know whether I could sum that up in words, because I think there are a lot of different dimensions of enlightenment, actually. But ultimately, it would have to include really knowing, not just conceptually, but knowing directly that one's nature is in and part of God, that we are inseparable from the totality of our being. And when we know that, there is letting go, a natural and spontaneous letting go of fear, of stress, of doubt, of hate, of judgment, of projection, and a settling into the beauty and the majesty and peace and the depth of being. And so enlightenment therefore brings forth a deep fulfillment, not because of this or that, it's independent of anything, and a radiance of that state, of that abiding, that brings whole reams of blessings for the world. And so in that enlightened condition, everyone is invited to rest in God along with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this hour that seems to have just gone by in a few seconds. I feel a lot of gratitude in my heart for your sharing, and deeply moved. And yeah, words can actually never really describe how I feel right now, but yeah, all that and much more. Thank you, Miranda. And for anybody who wants to find out more of Miranda's teachings, you can find her at mirandamacpherson.com.
And just to say, Macpherson is spelled Macpherson. So I just like to say to people, it was really my pleasure to put that website together. I launched it last year, and there's a live sanctuary in the website. And I really hope that people will enter into the sanctuary, because the whole point of it is to support you to enter into the inner sanctuary of your true nature. And so there's lots of goodies on my website, lots of articles that you can download and enjoy, and a lot of support for you to dive in and follow the thread of the luminosity of your being, and come to know more substantially who and what you really are. And from that, to find your way of being of benefit in our world, being a presence of love and wisdom.